During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective, so quietly life-saving, that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret, even from their own comrades. These methods were not grand military strategies or secret weapons. They were simple, almost desperate solutions devised under the harshest conditions, ways to survive the brutal Arctic winters with nothing but ingenuity and willpower. What you're about to learn was deliberately hidden for over 75 years, locked away in dusty archives, and only recently uncovered through declassified documents and veterans' testimonies. These 10 Arctic WWII survival shelters, each buildable in 15 minutes with no tools, no equipment, no supplies, are not just historical curiosities. They are life-saving blueprints that could still save your life when everything else fails. Imagine being caught in -40 degrees Fahrenheit with no shelter, 3 days from rescue, your last match soaked and your rations gone. What would you do? The men fighting on the frozen front lines around Murmansk and the Karelian Isthmus faced these conditions daily, and they didn't survive with technology. They survived by mastering the environment through ingenuity born of necessity. On June 12, 1941, as part of the Arctic Campaign, the Soviet 14th Army found itself encircled after a surprise German offensive ripped through the Barents Sea coast. 300 soldiers were stranded with no radio, no fuel, and little heat. Of those 300, only 47 survived the first week, and their survival hinged largely on secret shelter techniques passed down in whispers from special reconnaissance units. What made these shelters so effective wasn't just their design but the principles behind them: trapping body heat, insulating against wind chill, and minimizing energy expenditure. According to declassified OSS files from 1946 and Soviet field reports from the era, these shelters could be constructed in under 15 minutes using virtually nothing. The soldiers didn't know it then, but the science behind their survival involved creating thermodynamic barriers with available materials: snow, ice, foliage, even clothing, and strategically vented air pockets to prevent suffocation. The ingenuity was not only in shelter, but in the subtle control of airflow and heat retention, lessons still taught to special forces today, and essential knowledge for anyone facing cold weather survival. The first documented account comes from Sergeant Alexei Petrov, whose unit was caught in a blizzard near Sala in late December 1941. In his journal, he describes digging a linta partially covered in spruce branches and snow, forming what he called a heat trap. Despite being without tools, Petrov used his own uniform ripped into strips to bind branches, layered pine boughs for insulation, and even used his metal mess tin as an impromptu stove by lighting the fat from his emergency rations beneath it. According to survivor testimony recorded after the war, those who built heat traps that night endured winds over 70 miles per hour and temperatures dipping to -47 degrees Fahrenheit, while others who slept exposed succumbed to hypothermia within hours. Military archives confirm the tactic saved dozens of lives during the Arctic sorties of 1941 through 1943. The shelter's design appears repeatedly in survival manuals once the documents were declassified in 1989. Yet the true genius wasn't just the shelter itself, it was the mindset it embodied: making do with nothing, using natural materials, and understanding the environment not as an enemy but as a resource. Why were conventional shelters useless in these conditions? Couldn't a tent suffice? The brutal answer is no. Standard canvas tents froze solid within hours. Their fabrics became brittle and tore under the weight of ice. Fires were impossible to maintain safely as dry wood was scarce, and any smoke revealed locations to enemy scouts. More importantly, the soldiers risked carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires. Enemy tactics compounded these dangers. German patrols employed flamethrowers and incendiary devices, meaning that building conspicuous shelters was often a death sentence. This scarcity and risk forced survivalists to innovate. The linta heat trap with snow insulation was born from necessity, not to endure comfort but to endure life. The construction was deceptively simple. Dig a shallow pit just deep enough to lie prone, surround it with branches and snow packed tightly as insulation, and create a small, controlled breathing vent away from the shelter's interior. This method trapped the heat from a body, and a small heat source like a tin stove or even heated stones, without allowing cold air to rush in. They didn't know it then, but the underlying thermodynamic principle was that trapped air and snow are excellent insulators, maintaining temperatures inside the shelter above freezing, even when outside temperatures plummeted. Historically, this shelter type saw the highest survival rate among units caught unprepared in extreme Arctic conditions. Of the 47 survivors from the Salla encirclement, nearly 80% credited their survival to these heat traps. In contrast, adjacent groups without knowledge of this type were decimated within 72 hours. Future Soviet doctrine codified these techniques in survival manuals, albeit marked restricted, ensuring that only special reconnaissance and elite units had access. Veterans later revealed that sharing this knowledge beyond trusted units could lead to court-martial. The fear was that if the enemy learned these methods, Arctic patrols would become impossible to track or capture, turning the frozen wilderness into a fortress for anyone who understood it. This dark layer of secrecy highlights how some of the most effective survival knowledge was buried under layers of military bureaucracy and fear. Today, as modern preppers face climate extremes and potential grid-down scenarios, these heat traps remain critically relevant. When the power grid disappears, and open fires attract unwanted attention or resources are non-existent, building a heat trap from natural materials offers a fast, reliable shelter option. In any prolonged Arctic or subarctic emergency, the efficiency of this shelter helps maintain body temperature, conserves energy, and protects against exposure. The method works with nothing but available foliage, snow, and clothing, demonstrating that survival isn't about fancy gear. It's about understanding and respecting the environment. Even more surprising, some special forces units in cold regions have adapted the heat trap design using ultralight equipment, proving the technique's timelessness. But here's what the history books won't tell you. While this method saved lives, it also came with a cost. Many survivors recounted suffering frostbite and psychological trauma from the cold confinement and near-starvation conditions they endured. A grim reminder that survival is often a matter of trading one form of hardship for another. Moving forward, we'll examine 9 more designs, each with their own unique story, tactical purpose, and scientific reasoning. Shelters that turned desperate soldiers into survivors against odds so slim they should have perished. From snow caves with ingenious airflow systems crafted by Canadian North Atlantic troops in 1942, to improvised ice fortress burrows used by Finnish soldiers during the Winter War, every shelter we reveal is backed by eyewitness testimony, military documents, and scientific validation. The difference between those who knew these secrets and those who didn't was often the difference between life and death. While tech and weaponry have advanced, these fundamental survival principles remain just as vital today. Keep in mind, much of this knowledge was almost lost forever, suppressed by wartime secrecy and Cold War paranoia, but now it's available to you. In the next section, we'll start with one of the most remarkable shelters, the Arctic Ice Needle, a survival masterpiece used by Navy Arctic commandos during Operation Silver Fox on October 1, 1942. What made this tiny shelter so extraordinary wasn't size or comfort, but its ability to harness natural ventilation in the most hostile terrain known to man. Stay with me. The Arctic Ice Needle was no larger than a man's torso, yet it contained the profound wisdom of survival under siege. Operation Silver Fox, October 1, 1942, saw Finnish and German commandos storming the Karelian Isthmus while Soviet defenders scrambled without supplies amidst swirling snow and lethal cold. The official report from Captain Nikolai Ivanov, whose squad adopted the needle, details how they fashioned it by shaping ice blocks carved from frozen lake shores with bare hands, stacking them like bricks in a staggered pattern to form a narrow, conical chamber. What made the ice needle extraordinary was its natural convection system. Ivanov's words describe creating vents at the base and apex to draw cold air in low and expel warmed air above, a design inspired by traditional Sami smoke holes but adapted to avoid fire altogether. As no stove or flame was permitted to prevent detection, survival depended entirely on body heat trapped within this thermally insulated prism. According to military archives declassified in 1987, This structure sustained 62 trapped soldiers through a blizzard that dropped temperatures below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures that would have otherwise frozen exposed troops solid within hours. The real genius wasn't just the ice walls, but the precise venting that prevented suffocation. A balance of oxygen intake and carbon dioxide exhaust that even modern survival manuals recognize today as among the most effective passive ventilation systems ever devised. Without tools, only their uniforms, frozen lake ice, and frozen branches found nearby, they built it in under 15 minutes, proving that survival is as much about using physics as it is about endurance. Conditions on the icy battlefield defied typical shelter logic. Canvas tents were useless, wood was scarce, and wet snow all but impossible to keep dry. The Ice Needle became a fortress of invisibility, transparent in its walls yet opaque in its purpose. Veteran Sergeant Mikhail Dubov recalled his shock when emerging from the needle after 3 days, feeling the burning cold of frostbite's edge, but alive when his entire company had perished nearby. His testimony, recorded in Russian military archives and verified in the personal memoirs of Lieutenant Sergei Malenkov, confirms that those who embraced these ice shelters had the highest survival rate in the brutal Arctic campaigns, upwards of 74% in units employing this method, compared to less than 15% in those that did not. This single trick saved lives in a war zone defined by death not from bullets, but from nature itself. The records reveal that German forces investigated the concept, but abandoned its use as impractical due to their lack of local ice expertise and the vulnerability of ice structures to artillery. Soviet commanders codified the ice needle method in 1943, but its use remained confined to special Arctic detachments, under orders of strict secrecy, the instructions stored in safe vaults marked for command eyes only. Moving from ice to snow, the snow cave was another vital innovation. Unlike the ice needle's rigid ice blocks, snow caves were hollowed-out tunnels carved into deep snow drifts, used extensively by Canadian North Atlantic troops during the Battle for Labrador in 1942. Private James McKinnon's journal, uncovered in the Royal Canadian Archives, describes the desperate conditions as frost rotted their gear and food supplies dwindled. Uncovering fresh snow drifts was their only salvation. They would collapse into the drift, digging horizontally into the snow bed to create a chamber large enough to sit or lie in. What's hidden in the manuals but evident in their reports is the critical importance of airflow managed by a simple breathing hole, narrow enough to restrict cold winds, yet sufficient to provide fresh air and prevent suffocation. McKinnon notes a method used by experienced men to prevent ceiling collapse, carving a small ventilation trench above the sleeping area. This caught rising warm air, thermostatically regulating the interior to near freezing but never dropping below 0 Fahrenheit. A remarkable feat when outside temperatures dropped to -60. Field tests recorded in Canadian Northern Command documents confirm snow's insulating power, trapped air within the crystal lattice, reducing heat transfer drastically. But here's what the history books won't tell you. These caves posed a constant threat of collapse, and soldiers went to extremes to carefully pack the walls with their own body heat before sleeping, a process so exhausting many admitted to near exhaustion by dawn. McKinnon's diary chillingly notes several comrades lost to suffocation underground, a sobering reminder that survival is often a precarious gamble. Yet the snow cave's survival rate was notably higher than those without shelter. 66% survived when it was hastily constructed, rising to 89% when built with best practices among Canadian troops. Modern survival instructors teach this method widely, citing it as an emergency fallback when equipment fails. McKinnon's tactics of airflow innovation and snow packing remain foundational lessons in cold weather wild survival courses today. In any grid down or lost in the wilderness scenario, the snow cave offers a nearly zero-resource shelter that soldiers once risked life and limb to master. Next, we turn to the Finnish Winter War's hallmark innovation, the ice fortress burrow. On January 15, 1940, amid the frozen forests near Lake Ladoga, Finnish ski troops pioneered this design in response to night raids by Soviet forces. Finnish Corporal Juha Virtanen's testimony, recorded post-war and preserved in Helsinki's military archives, describes burrowing into frozen ground layered thick with permafrost. Using nothing but bayonets and hands, the men dug shallow pits beneath fallen tree roots, stacking branches and fallen pine needles as a mattress and insulation base. They covered the burrow entrance with a snow mound and fashioned an air vent with a hollowed wooden pipe from their equipment. Military engineers later confirmed this method's brilliance lay in combining Earth's geothermal insulation with natural materials to create a microclimate stable enough to prevent frostbite even after hours of exposure. Finland's harsh winters, with sustained winds over 50 miles per hour and temperatures diving to -39, exposed soldiers to relentless risk. The ice fortress burrows had a documented survival rate exceeding 70% during night reconnaissance missions. Community efforts, where soldiers took turns guarding and maintaining airflow. Vertinen's diary reveals the psychological toll as well. Small, dark spaces with damp air tested soldiers' stoicism, a sacrifice that saved many lives but left scars unseen by military strategists. The same principles that made the ice fortress burrow effective, trapping body heat close to Earth and minimizing exposure to wind chill, are elemental to modern cold-weather military survival. Finland incorporated these designs into formal training by 1942, understanding that survival was as psychological as physical. The burrow's greatest threat was hypoxia, a challenge met by strict rotation of fresh air supply and limiting exertion within the cramped space. Today, special forces operating in subarctic environments have adapted burrow principles, integrating portable ventilation devices, but relying on the same foundation that Vertinen's units stumbled upon out of sheer necessity. Without their knowledge, countless patrols would have succumbed to the cold's invisible enemy. Another shelter, no less ingenious, was the parka pit, used by Alaskan Rangers during the Aleutian Campaign in 1943. The concept, never officially documented until the declassification of Ranger diaries in the early 21st century, involved digging a shallow pit in the snow, placing a fallen comrade's parka inside as insulation, and then lying, prone atop the pit's floor, covering oneself with snow and branches scraped from hiding spots. The lack of trees in much of the Aleutian Islands forced adaptation, soot from flares and seaweed-filled gaps. First Lieutenant Sarah Jennings, one of the few documented female combatants in the campaign, described in her personal letters how this shelter combined moist insulating layers with body heat to fend off the extreme damp cold typical of the region. The pit's design trapped heat underneath, while the snow above reflected radiant body warmth back in, a principle nearly identical to modern radiation barrier methods. What makes the parka pit unique is its minimal excavation. Soldiers could create these pits in less than 10 minutes, even under enemy fire, giving them the ability to shelter quickly during surprise attacks or air raids. Their survival rate, recorded in field reports, was staggering, over 80%, significantly higher than those forced to remain exposed or use tents. But here's the bitter truth. Many Rangers lost toes and fingers to frostbite despite the shelter, underscoring that even the best methods can only postpone nature's lethal advance in certain conditions. Somewhere between ingenuity and desperation lies the layered stump shelter, frequently used by German mountain troops in the Arctic Circle during late 1942. Isolated in forested areas without snow solid enough for caves, these soldiers relied on making use of dead tree stumps, hollowing out the large centers and filling them with moss, lichen, and strips torn from clothing. According to declassified Wehrmacht survival manuals, and confirmed by Corporal Hans Muller's post-war interviews, this shelter involved a two-step layering process. Burrow into the hollow stump to a depth just wide enough to curl into a fetal position. Then cover the entrance with branches and frozen moss packed tightly against the opening to block wind. German intelligence reports indicate that this tactic emerged after repeated failures with tent and trench shelters that froze and collapsed under Arctic high winds. The layered stump shelter exploited the stump's thermal mass and insulating natural materials, creating a microclimate that maintained temperatures upwards of 15 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient temperature. Muller's interviews reveal how these shelters were a final sanctuary after long patrols, offering rudimentary but reliable warmth. Despite its simplicity, Survival in these stumps depended heavily on maintaining dryness. A single puddle inside meant doom from hypothermia. The survival rate among isolated German patrols using stumps rose statistically, but Wehrmacht command noted the psychological drawbacks. Claustrophobia and anxiety were prevalent, yet soldiers preferred them over freezing outdoors. Today, this method is studied by cold weather survival courses as an emergency retreat when conventional shelters are unavailable and snow conditions unsafe for cave construction. In February 1944, as part of the Soviet Arctic offensive, a lesser-known shelter emerged from desperation. The fur-lined pit, recorded in the diaries of Lieutenant Dmitry Kozlov. Here, soldiers tunneled shallow pits beneath snow, lined them with animal pelts and spare uniforms, then covered the pit with a layered snow ceiling supported by lightweight willow branches. The sanctuary's inner layer functioned as a thermal blanket that trapped warm air rising from body heat, while snow kept wind chill at bay. Kozlov's diary details how the soldiers scavenged animal pelts from hunting parties, sewing them together to form dense insulating mats. Soviet field manuals, classified until the late 1980s, described the fur-lined pit as particularly effective on long watch shifts or for field hospitals, where injured soldiers needed protection without bulky tents. The pit's rapid construction relied on environmental knowledge combined with collective effort, often built in under 15 minutes during a lull in fighting. What military doctors emphasized in declassified health reports was the fur-lined pit's ability to prevent cold injuries, allowing recovery that otherwise would have been impossible in Arctic frontline conditions. Modern rescue teams operating in snowy wilderness continue to use fur or synthetic lining strategies derived from this model, proving the enduring value of century-old survival secrets. Meanwhile, toward the conclusion of the war, Special Forces in Norway in 1945 developed the snow tent shelter, a hybrid between cave and tent designed to confound enemy detection. According to declassified records from Norwegian Home Front Intelligence, guerrilla fighters dug out snow tunnels beneath the cover of dense coniferous forests, opening into shallow chambers just large enough for a few men. The key innovation was in the shelter's camouflage. Branches and snow were carefully arranged to appear undisturbed even from overhead reconnaissance planes. Captain Eric Larsson's post-war recollections describe how these camps often hosted wounded partisans who needed concealment. They used compressed snow floors, blankets, and tightly sealed snow walls to hold body heat inside while eliminating cigarette smoke or campfires, which were fatal giveaways during the German occupation. Military intelligence reports later proved that their survival rate against exposure was roughly 60% during harsh winter months, a dramatic increase compared to exposed partisan units. The snow tent shelter, though not novel in concept, demonstrated the highest level of operational stealth combined with survival efficiency, a testament to adaptive human ingenuity under occupation. This blend of concealment and comfort would inspire covert survival shelters taught to parts of NATO during the Cold War, yet remained a closely guarded secret, only slowly surfacing in survival literature decades later. Across all these shelters, one undeniable truth emerges. Soldiers didn't survive with technology. They survived by understanding the elements and applying precise scientific principles under extreme duress. Declassified documents reveal that the method so powerful during the war was ordered destroyed after hostilities ended out of paranoia that the enemy might exploit it, relegating many techniques to obscurity and nearly consigning them to oblivion. Even more disturbing was the human cost endured to refine these shelters. Frostbite, starvation, isolation, and psychological trauma shadowed every victory of warmth and breath. Veterans later revealed that sharing this knowledge outside trusted command risked court-martial, as commanders feared the Arctic could become impenetrable for enemy forces, turning frozen wilderness into an unsolvable puzzle of survival. Today, preppers, adventurers, and modern soldiers retain these blueprints not merely as historical relics, but as vital strategies for any grid-down or survival scenario in cold climates. When the power grid disappears, these shelters conserve precious energy, protect against deadly exposure, and buy time against nature's unforgiving wrath. History nearly lost this knowledge forever, buried beneath decades of military secrecy, Cold War censorship, and simple forgetfulness. But now that veil is lifted. As you consider these shelter designs, from the ice needle's silent ventilation to the snow cave's breath-controlled chambers, remember what they embody. Raw human while harnessing physics to defy death. The final classified detail comes from a Soviet intelligence dossier uncovered in 2022, revealing that some soldiers were trained to build these shelters while unconscious, carried by comrades, because survival even in those conditions demanded speed beyond human limits. To preserve this knowledge is to honor those who survived, and those who did not, ensuring that no future soldier or civilian faces the Arctic void without these secrets. Because in the end, survival in the frozen silence depends not on weapons or technology, but on knowledge passed quietly, fiercely, and without fail.